The night Caleb Mercer walked into that blood-stained saloon in Red Hollow, he had no intention of gambling for anything beyond whiskey and silence. But when a hollow-eyed drifter slammed a bruised woman onto the poker table like she was livestock, and the whole room erupted in laughter, something ancient and furious woke up inside him. One hand of cards later, Caleb owned a human being he never wanted, and a decision that would either destroy his dying ranch or resurrect it from the grave. What he didn't know was that the silent woman covered in prairie dirt held secrets powerful enough to ignite a war across the entire Montana territory. If you want to see how a gamble everyone mocked became the most dangerous thing in the West, stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Caleb Mercer hadn't spoken to another human being in 6 days when he finally saddled his horse and rode the 12 miles down from his mountain homestead into Red Hollow. The silence up there had started eating at him, not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with solitude, but the oppressive weight of a man realizing he might die alone on land that had already given up on him. 7 years he'd been out there, 7 winters watching his crops fail, his livestock thin out, his hope shrivel like corn stalks in a drought. He was 45 years old and felt 70. His hands were scarred, his back was shot, and his soul was so tired he could barely remember why he'd bothered staying. Red Hollow wasn't much of a town. 2 streets of crooked buildings, a mercantile that gouged you on flour, a livery run by a man who drank more than the horses, and the Broken Spoke Saloon, an establishment that served rot-gut whiskey and hosted poker games where men lost months of wages in a single night. Caleb tied his horse outside and pushed through the doors into a wall of smoke, sweat, and shouting. The place was packed. 30 men, maybe more, crowded around tables or leaning against the bar. The air was thick enough to choke on. He found a spot at the bar and ordered whiskey. The bartender, a scarred man named Dutch, poured him 2 fingers of something that smelled like kerosene. Caleb drank it anyway. It burned going down, but at least it was a different kind of pain than the one he'd been carrying. "Big game tonight," Dutch said, nodding toward the back corner. Caleb followed his gaze. A poker table was surrounded by a tight crowd of onlookers, all of them shouting and jeering. He could hear the slap of cards, the clink of coins, the occasional roar of triumph or groan of defeat. He didn't care. He wasn't here to gamble. He was here to be around people, even if they were the worst kind of people. But then the crowd erupted in laughter. Not the good-natured kind, but the cruel, sharp laughter of men who'd found something weaker than themselves to mock. Caleb's gut tightened. He'd heard that sound before. It was the sound of a pack closing in. "You ain't got nothing left, drifter," someone shouted. "Then get the hell out. Wait. A desperate voice cut through the noise. "I got one more thing." The laughter died down into something uglier. Anticipation. Caleb turned on his stool, whiskey forgotten. Through the shifting wall of bodies, he caught a glimpse of the poker table. A man stood there, wild-eyed and sweating, his coat torn and his face covered in dust. He looked like he'd been riding hard for days. And beside him, slumped in a chair with her head down, was a woman. She was filthy. Her dress was torn at the hem and caked with dirt. Her hair hung in matted tangles around her face. Her hands were bound loosely with rope, resting in her lap. She didn't look up. She didn't move. She just sat there like a ghost. "I got her," the drifter said, his voice shaking. "She's worth something. She's got to be worth something." The room went dead silent for 3 seconds. Then someone laughed. Then everyone laughed. It was the kind of laughter that made Caleb's skin crawl. "You're offering a woman as collateral?" The man sitting across from the drifter was big, well-dressed, and clearly the one with all the money on the table. His name was Emmett Glover, a cattle buyer with a reputation for cruelty and a wallet fat enough to prove it. "What the hell am I supposed to do with that?" "She can work," the drifter said quickly. "She can cook, clean, whatever you want. She's strong. She won't complain." Emmett leaned back in his chair, grinning like a wolf. "She looks half dead to me." "She's not dead, she's just quiet." "Where'd you get her?" "That ain't your business." "It is if I'm supposed to take her off your hands." Emmett's grin widened. "You steal her from someone?" The drifter hesitated. That hesitation told Caleb everything he needed to know. This man didn't own her in any legal sense. He'd found her somewhere, or taken her, or bought her off someone else who had no right to sell her in the first place. The whole thing stank. "I won her fair," the drifter lied. "In a game up north. She's mine to wager." Won her. Emmett laughed again. Hell, boy, you can't win a person. You can out here, someone in the crowd muttered, and that got more laughter. Caleb's hands tightened into fists. He told himself to stay out of it. This wasn't his fight. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know the drifter. He had no business stepping into whatever mess this was. But his feet were already moving. He pushed through the crowd, shoving past men who smelled like wet leather and tobacco, until he was standing at the edge of the poker table. I'll play, Caleb said. Every head in the room turned toward him. Emmett looked him up and down, taking in the worn boots, the patched coat, the calloused hands. Who the hell are you? Name's Caleb Mercer. Never heard of you. That's because I mind my business. Caleb pulled a small leather pouch from his coat pocket and dropped it on the table. It hit the wood with a heavy clink. That's $40 in silver. I'll play one hand. Winner takes the pot and whatever else is on the table. Emmett's eyes narrowed. You're betting on this woman? I'm betting on the game. Same thing, old man. Caleb didn't flinch. You in or not? The drifter looked like he wanted to argue, but Emmett waved him off. Sit down, Mercer. Let's see what you got. Caleb sat. The crowd pressed in closer, sensing blood. Dutch shuffled the deck with practiced hands, then dealt 5 cards to each of them, Caleb, Emmett, and the drifter. Caleb picked up his hand slowly, keeping his face neutral. 2 kings, a 7, a 4, a 2. Not great, but not terrible. Emmett studied his cards, then tossed 2 into the center. 2! The drifter hesitated, then threw down 3. 3. Caleb looked at his cards again. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, could hear the shallow breathing of the woman sitting 3 feet away. He threw down 3 cards. 3. Dutch dealt the replacements. Caleb picked up his new cards one at a time. A king, a jack, and another king. 3 kings. His heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He set the cards face down on the table and waited. Bets to you, drifter, Dutch said. The drifter stared at his cards like they held the meaning of life. Finally, he shoved the last of his coins into the pot. All in. Emmett smirked. Call. He added a stack of bills to the pile. Caleb didn't hesitate. He pushed his pouch forward. Call. Show him. The drifter laid down his hand first. A pair of 8s. Weak, desperate. Exactly what Caleb expected. The crowd groaned. Emmett went next, his grin spreading wide. 3 queens. He spread the cards on the table like a weapon. Read 'em and weep, boys. The room erupted. Men slapped Emmett on the back, whooping and hollering. The drifter's face went gray. He stood up, swaying like he might pass out. Then Caleb laid down his cards. 3 kings. The noise cut off like someone had slammed a door. Emmett's grin vanished. He stared at the cards, then at Caleb, then back at the cards. You son of a... Game's over, Caleb said quietly. He stood, scooped the money into his pouch, and turned toward the woman. She still hadn't moved. She still hadn't looked up. Caleb crouched down beside her chair, putting himself at her eye level. Ma'am? She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, empty and distant. Caleb reached out slowly and untied the rope around her wrists. The moment it fell away, she flinched. Just a small jerk, like she expected to be hit. Caleb pulled his hand back. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. You understand me? I'm not going to hurt you. Still nothing. Caleb straightened and looked at the drifter, who was still standing there, pale and shaking. Where'd you really get her? I told you, I won her. You're a liar, Caleb said flatly. And if I ever see you again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. Now get out. The drifter didn't argue. He stumbled toward the door, nearly tripping over his own feet, and disappeared into the night. The crowd started to disperse, muttering among themselves. Some of them looked at Caleb like he was crazy. Others just looked disappointed the show was over. Emmett stood up, his face red with anger. You think you just did something noble, Mercer? I think I won a poker game. You just bought yourself a world of trouble. That woman's got no papers, no name, nothing. You don't know who she is or where she came from. For all you know, she's running from a hanging. Then I guess that's my problem, Caleb said. He held out his hand toward the woman. Come on, let's go. She looked at his hand for a long time. Then, slowly, she took it. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. Caleb helped her to her feet, and together they walked out of the Broken Spoke Saloon into the freezing Montana night. Behind them, the laughter started up again. Cruel, mocking, certain that Caleb Mercer had just made the stupidest mistake of his life. The ride back to the homestead took 3 hours. Caleb let the woman ride his horse while he walked beside it, leading the animal by the reins. She didn't say a word the entire time. She just sat in the saddle, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the horn like it was the only solid thing in the world. Caleb didn't push her. He didn't ask questions. He just walked, his boots crunching through frozen grass, his breath misting in the cold air. By the time they reached the cabin, it was past midnight. The moon was high and full, casting long shadows across the rocky yard. Caleb helped the woman down from the horse, then led her inside. The cabin was small. One room, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a bed in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Caleb lit a lantern and stoked the fire until the flames caught and began to spread heat through the space. "You can sleep in the bed," Caleb said, nodding toward the corner. "I'll take the floor." The woman stood in the middle of the room, staring at the fire like she'd never seen one before. Caleb grabbed a blanket from a chest and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched again, but this time she didn't pull away. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash," Caleb said, "and I've got some bread and dried meat if you're hungry." She didn't respond. Caleb sighed and sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted. He'd acted on instinct back in that saloon, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Anger maybe, or disgust, or just the bone-deep loneliness of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to protect something other than himself. Now, sitting in his cabin with a stranger who wouldn't speak, he wondered if Emmett had been right. Maybe he had bought himself trouble. Maybe this woman was dangerous, or crazy, or worse. But when he looked at her, all he saw was someone who'd been broken, and Caleb knew what that felt like. "My name's Caleb," he said quietly. "Caleb Mercer. This is my land such as it is. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you, and nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do. You hear me?" The woman finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, shadowed by exhaustion, and something deeper. Trauma, maybe, or grief. For a moment, Caleb thought she might speak, but she just nodded, once, and turned back to the fire. Caleb stood and moved toward the door. "I'll be outside checking on the horse. You get some rest." He stepped out into the cold, closing the door softly behind him. The night was silent except for the wind moving through the pine trees. Caleb leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the dark shape of his fields. Barren, rocky, useless. 7 years he'd been trying to make this land work, and 7 years it had fought him every step of the way. He didn't know why he stayed. Stubbornness? Maybe. Or just the lack of anywhere else to go. Inside the cabin, the woman stood by the fire, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She looked at the bed in the corner, then at the floor, then back at the fire. Slowly, carefully, she knelt down and pressed her hand against the rough wooden planks. Her fingers traced the grain, feeling the texture, the solidity of it. Then she closed her eyes and exhaled, long and slow, like she'd been holding her breath for days. For the first time in a long time, she felt the ground beneath her, and it was real. Caleb woke to the sound of movement outside. He shot upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. The sun was barely up, the sky still gray with dawn. He'd fallen asleep at the table, his head resting on his arms. The fire had burned down to embers. The woman was gone. Caleb's heart kicked into his throat. He grabbed the rifle and bolted out the door, scanning the yard. The horse was still tied to the post. The gate to the small paddock was still closed. And then he saw her. She was kneeling in the dirt about 50 yards from the cabin, right in the middle of one of his dead fields. Her dress was hiked up around her knees, her hands buried in the soil. She was digging, not frantically, but methodically, like she was searching for something. Caleb set the rifle down and walked toward her, his boots crunching through the frost. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just kept digging, scooping up handfuls of dirt and letting it sift through her fingers. Then she brought it to her nose and smelled it. Her face twisted into something between confusion and frustration. "It's dead," Caleb said flatly. "That whole field is dead. I've tried everything. Crop rotation, fertilizer, prayer. Nothing grows here. Hasn't for years. The woman finally looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp now, focused in a way they hadn't been the night before. "It's not dead," she said. Her voice was low, rough from disuse, but clear. Caleb stared at her. "You can talk." "I can talk." She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "And this land isn't dead. It's angry." "Angry," Caleb repeated, like she'd just told him the earth had feelings. "You've been farming it wrong," she said. She gestured at the field, at the rows of brittle stalks from last year's failed crop. "You planted the same thing every year, didn't you? Wheat, maybe some corn." "Yeah, so?" "So you stripped the soil, took everything out and put nothing back. The land's exhausted." She crouched down again, this time running her fingers through the dirt more carefully. "But it's not gone. The nutrients are still here, buried deep. You just need to bring them back." Caleb crossed his arms, skeptical. "And how exactly do you know that?" "My father was a botanist," she said simply. "Taught me everything he knew before he died. I've studied soil, plants, ecosystems. I know how to read land." "A botanist," Caleb said slowly. "Out here?" "He worked for a university back east. We traveled the frontier for years studying agricultural systems, native plant species, soil composition. He believed the West could sustain itself if people just learned how to work with the land instead of against it." She stood again, meeting Caleb's eyes. He was right. Caleb studied her. In the morning light, he could see her more clearly now. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe early 30s. Her face was still smudged with dirt, her hair still tangled, but there was something fierce in her expression. Intelligence, determination, something that hadn't been beaten out of her despite whatever hell she'd been through. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. "Vivian," she said. "Vivian Ashcroft." "Well, Vivian Ashcroft," Caleb said, "if you can make this land grow, I'll owe you more than I can ever repay." Vivian looked back at the field, her jaw set. "I'll need seeds, specific ones. Clover, alfalfa, maybe some buckwheat, things that fix nitrogen back into the soil. And I'll need time." "How much time?" "Depends on how much you're willing to trust me." Caleb thought about that. He thought about the 7 years he'd spent alone, the crops that had failed, the animals that had starved, the slow, grinding hopelessness that had driven him down into that saloon the night before. He thought about the fact that this woman, who he'd won in a poker game like she was a piece of livestock, was standing in his field talking about nitrogen and soil composition like she knew exactly what she was doing. "I don't have much choice," Caleb said finally. "Do what you need to do." Vivian nodded, a flicker of something, relief maybe, or resolve, crossing her face. "Then we start today." By midday, Vivian had walked every inch of Caleb's land. She moved through the fields like she was reading a book, crouching down every few feet to dig her fingers into the soil, pull up dead roots, examine the way water drained through the ground. She didn't ask Caleb for help. She just worked, silent and focused, her movements efficient and practiced. Caleb followed at a distance, watching her, trying to figure out if she was brilliant or insane. "This section here," Vivian said, pointing to a patch of ground near the eastern fence line. "It's rockier, but the drainage is good. We'll plant root vegetables first. Carrots, turnips, maybe some potatoes. They'll break up the compacted soil and bring nutrients closer to the surface." "I tried potatoes 2 years ago," Caleb said. "They rotted in the ground." "Because you planted them too early and too deep," Vivian said without looking at him. "And I'm guessing you didn't rotate your crops beforehand, so the soil was already depleted." Caleb scowled. "You got an answer for everything." "No," Vivian said, "but I've got answers for this." They spent the rest of the day mapping out a plan. Vivian sketched diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing Caleb where they'd plant legumes to restore nitrogen, where they'd rotate grains to avoid stripping the soil, where they'd build windbreaks to protect young crops from the brutal Montana winds. She talked about companion planting, about using livestock manure as fertilizer, about timing planting cycles with the phases of the moon. Caleb listened, skeptical but intrigued. Most of what she was saying sounded insane, but some of it, the stuff about crop rotation, about soil depletion, about working with the land instead of forcing it, made a strange kind of sense. "Where'd you learn all this?" Caleb asked. "My father," Vivian said again. "He spent his whole life studying how plants adapt to harsh environments. He believed the frontier didn't have to be a wasteland. He believed people could thrive here if they just understood the science. And what happened to him? Vivian's face went dark. He died 3 years ago. Pneumonia. I'm sorry. Don't be. He lived the life he wanted. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. After he died, I tried to keep his work going. But a woman traveling alone with scientific journals and botanical samples isn't exactly welcome in most frontier towns. I got robbed twice, nearly assaulted once, and eventually ended up with the wrong people. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was reciting a grocery list. That's how I ended up in that saloon. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Vivian looked at him, her expression unreadable. Why'd you do it? Do what? Win me in that game. You didn't know me. You didn't know if I was dangerous or sick or crazy. You just stepped in and gambled your money on a stranger. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I didn't like the way they were laughing, he said finally. That's all. Vivian held his gaze, then nodded slowly. Well, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said. You haven't seen winter up here. Wads. The work began the next morning. Vivian had Caleb ride into Red Hollow to buy seeds, clover, alfalfa, turnips, carrots, anything she'd listed. He came back with 2 sacks worth and a lot of suspicious looks from the mercantile owner, who wanted to know what the hell he was planning to do with all that. Farming, Caleb said flatly, and left before the man could ask more questions. Vivian planted the first seeds herself, kneeling in the dirt with her hands deep in the soil. She moved with precision, spacing everything perfectly, whispering instructions to Caleb as he worked beside her. Not too deep. Press it down gently. Give it room to breathe. Caleb felt ridiculous. He was 45 years old and being taught how to plant seeds by a woman half his age who he'd won in a poker game. But he followed her instructions, and by the end of the first week, neat rows of green were starting to push through the rocky ground. It was the first time in 7 years Caleb had seen anything grow on his land that wasn't a weed. Word spread fast in a territory where nothing stayed secret for long. Settlers passing through on the main road saw the green sprouting from Caleb Mercer's fields and stopped to ask questions. Vivian answered them all, patient and thorough, explaining crop rotation and soil restoration like she was teaching a class. Some people listened, others laughed and rode on, convinced she was a con artist or a lunatic. But the ones who listened, the desperate ones, the ones whose own crops were failing, whose children were going hungry, they came back. They climbed the mountain to Caleb's homestead with questions, with their own bags of seeds, with dirt samples they wanted Vivian to examine. She helped all of them. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for anything. She just taught them, shared her father's knowledge, and sent them home with instructions scribbled on scraps of paper. Caleb watched it all happen, half amazed and half terrified. His lonely, dying homestead was turning into something else. A gathering place, a hub of desperate hope. People started calling Vivian the Plant Woman, and they said her name with a mix of reverence and suspicion, like she was half saint and half witch. This is going to bring trouble, Caleb said one evening as they sat by the fire. People don't like it when something they don't understand starts working. I know, Vivian said quietly, but I'm not going to stop. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm just saying, be careful. Vivian looked at him, her eyes steady. I've been careful my whole life, Caleb. It didn't save me, so I'd rather be useful. Caleb didn't have an answer for that, so he just stared into the fire and hoped she was right. But trouble was already coming, and it had a name, Victor Hale. Victor Hale owned half the territory, and he wanted the other half. Everyone knew it. He ran the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, controlled the water rights to most of the decent grazing land, and had enough money to buy off sheriffs, judges, and anyone else who might get in his way. He was 52 years old, built like a bull, and had the kind of smile that made you check your pockets afterward. People said he'd killed 3 men in his younger days, though nobody could prove it. What they could prove was that anyone who crossed Victor Hale ended up broke, beaten, or gone. He first heard about Vivian Ashcroft from his foreman, a wiry man named Dugan, who rode up to the main ranch house one afternoon with news that something strange was happening up on Caleb Mercer's mountain. The land's turning green, Dugan said, standing in Victor's office with his hat in his hands. I saw it myself. Mercer's fields, well, The ones that have been dead for years, they're growing crops now. Good ones. Victor looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. Mercer? That hermit who lives up past the ridge? That's the one. But he's not alone anymore. He's got a woman up there. Word is she's some kind of plant expert, teaching people how to fix their soil, rotate crops, all sorts of things. Settlers are riding up there from all over, asking her for help. Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. A woman. Yeah, they're calling her the plant woman. Some folks think she's touched in the head, but the ones who listen to her, their crops are coming in. I've seen it. Victor was quiet for a moment, his mind working. The frontier was a hard place, and most of the settlers who tried to farm it failed within 2 years. That was good for men like Victor. Failed farmers sold their land cheap, and Victor bought it up, expanding his empire one bankrupt homestead at a time. But if this woman was actually helping people succeed, if she was teaching them how to make the land work, that was a problem. A big problem. What's her name? Victor asked. Vivian Ashcroft. Don't know much else about her. She just showed up a few weeks ago. Find out everything you can, Victor said. Where she came from, who she is, what she's doing up there. And don't be subtle about it. I want her to know I'm watching. Dugan nodded and left. Victor sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the vast stretch of land that bore his name. He'd built this empire through ruthlessness and patience, and he wasn't about to let some woman with dirt under her fingernails unravel it. If Vivian Ashcroft was a threat, he'd deal with her the way he dealt with all threats. He'd own her, or he'd destroy her. 3 days later, Dugan came back with a report. Vivian Ashcroft had no property, no family, no legal standing in the territory. She'd appeared out of nowhere, and before that she'd been traveling with a drifter who'd lost her in a poker game. That was all anyone knew. Victor smiled when he heard that. A woman with no papers, no identity, no claim to anything. She was a ghost, and ghosts were easy to erase. He decided to pay her a visit. Victor rode up to Caleb Mercer's homestead on a cold afternoon in late spring, flanked by Dugan and 2 other hired men. They came on horseback, moving slowly up the narrow mountain road, taking their time. Victor wanted to be seen. He wanted Caleb and Vivian to know exactly who was coming. When they reached this property, Caleb was outside chopping wood. He saw the riders approaching and set down the axe, his face going hard. Vivian was in the field, kneeling beside a row of young bean plants, but she stood when she heard the horses. Victor dismounted and walked toward Caleb, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Caleb Mercer. Been a long time. Caleb didn't return the smile. Victor, what do you want? Just thought I'd ride up and see what all the fuss is about. Heard you've got a miracle worker living with you now. Victor's gaze shifted to Vivian, who was walking toward them from the field. That her? She's got a name, Caleb said, and she's not interested in whatever you're selling. Victor laughed, a deep rumbling sound. I'm not selling anything, Mercer. I'm just curious. People are saying she's teaching farmers how to save their land. That true? Vivian stopped a few feet away, her hands still dirty from the soil. She looked at Victor with the same calm, unflinching expression she'd shown Caleb the first time they met. I'm teaching them what my father taught me. Soil science, crop rotation. It's not magic. Didn't say it was, Victor said. But it's impressive. Real impressive. Makes me wonder where you learned all that. My father was a botanist. And where's he now? Dead. Victor nodded slowly, like he was filing that information away. Sorry to hear that. Must have been hard losing him. Leaves a woman in a tough spot, doesn't it? No family, no protection, dangerous world out here for someone on their own. Caleb stepped forward, his jaw tight. She's not on her own. She's with me. Victor's smile widened. With you. Right. Because you won her in a poker game. He looked at Vivian again. That true? You were wagered like a sack of flour? Vivian's expression didn't change. I was in a bad situation. Caleb helped me out of it. That's all you need to know. Except it's not all I need to know, Victor said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. See, the way I hear it, you don't have any papers, no deed, no claim, no proof you even exist, which means, legally, you're nobody. And if you're nobody, then you don't have any right to be teaching people things, giving them advice, interfering with the natural way things work out here. The natural way, Vivian said flatly. You mean the way where people starve because they don't know how to farm properly, and then you buy their land for pennies? Victor's smile vanished. Careful. I'm not being careless, Vivian said. I'm being accurate. The two of them stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Caleb's hand moved toward the axe, but Victor's men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their gun belts. The message was clear. Victor broke the silence first. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop giving out advice. You're going to stop teaching people. And you're going to stay up here on this mountain and mind your own business. Because if you don't, I'm going to make it my business to find out exactly who you are and where you came from. And I'm betting there's something in your past you don't want people knowing about. There's nothing, Vivian said. Everyone's got something, Victor said. He turned to Caleb. You're a smart man, Mercer. Smarter than most. Don't let her drag you into something you can't get out of. He mounted his horse and signaled to his men. They turned and rode back down the mountain, leaving Caleb and Vivian standing in the yard, the air still crackling with the weight of what had just been said. Caleb exhaled slowly. He's not bluffing. I know, Vivian said. He'll come after you. He'll dig into your past, find out where you've been, who you've talked to. And if he can't find anything, he'll make something up. Let him try. Caleb grabbed her arm, not hard, but firm enough to make her look at him. Vivian, this isn't a game. Victor Hale destroys people. That's what he does. If you keep teaching those settlers, if you keep helping them succeed, he's going to see you as a threat. And he doesn't negotiate with threats. He eliminates them. Vivian pulled her arm free, her eyes flashing. I'm not stopping. Those people need help, and I'm the only one who can give it to them. If Victor wants to come after me, fine. But I'm not going to hide. Then you're going to get killed. Maybe, Vivian said, but at least I'll die doing something that matters. Caleb stared at her, frustration and fear warring in his chest. He wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the cabin and keep her safe. But he knew it wouldn't work. Vivian wasn't the kind of woman who could be locked up or silenced. She'd been through too much, lost too much, to back down now. Fine, Caleb said finally. But if he comes back, we do this together. You don't face him alone. Vivian nodded. Together. They stood there for a moment, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the green fields that shouldn't have existed. And for the first time since Caleb had won her in that poker game, he realized he wasn't just protecting a stranger anymore. He was protecting someone he was starting to care about. Victor didn't come back right away, but his presence lingered like smoke. Settlers who'd been riding up to the homestead started arriving with nervous faces and whispered warnings. Victor's men had been asking questions in town, spreading rumors. Some people said Vivian was a con artist. Others said she was a witch. A few even claimed she was wanted for murder back east, though nobody could say where or why. It's all lies, Caleb said one evening as he and Vivian sat by the fire. Victor's trying to turn people against you. I know, Vivian said. She was mending a tear in her dress, her hands steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. But it's working. I can see it in their faces when they come up here now. They're scared. Scared of you or scared of him? Both. Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare and die. We could leave. Pack up, head north, start over somewhere Victor doesn't have reach. Vivian looked at him, surprised. You'd give up your land? I'd give up a lot of things to keep you safe. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Vivian set down the dress, her hands folding in her lap. Why? Because you're the first person in 7 years who's made this place feel like it's worth fighting for, Caleb said quietly. Before you showed up, I was just waiting to die. Now, I'm not. Vivian's throat tightened. She wasn't used to people caring about her, wasn't used to someone seeing her as more than a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried. I'm not leaving, she said, and neither are you. Then we're going to have to fight. I know. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of growing things, of life pushing up through rocky soil. It was a small miracle, that green, and neither of them was willing to let it be destroyed. The first real blow came 2 weeks later. A young couple named Thomas and Mary Garrett had been using Vivian's methods on their small plot of land east of Red Hollow. Their crops had come in strong, and they'd been excited, hopeful for the first time in years. But one morning, they woke to find their entire field trampled, every plant crushed, every row destroyed. And burned into the dirt near the fence line was a message: "Stay off Mercer's Mountain." Thomas rode up to Caleb's homestead that afternoon, his face pale and his hands shaking. It was Victor's men, had to be. Nobody else would do this. Vivian stood on the porch, staring at Thomas like she'd been hit. "Your whole field, everything, months of work, gone." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Did you see who did it?" "No, but I know. Everyone knows." Thomas looked at Vivian, his eyes full of anger and fear. "They did it because of you, because we listened to you." "I'm sorry," Vivian said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring back my crop," Thomas said bitterly. He turned his horse and rode back down the mountain without another word. Vivian stood there long after he was gone, her hands gripping the porch railing so hard her knuckles went white. Caleb came up beside her, but he didn't touch her. He didn't know what to say. "This is my fault," Vivian said finally. "I pushed too hard. I should have known Victor would retaliate." "This isn't your fault. It's his. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. That family's crop is gone, and it's because they trusted me." She turned to Caleb, her eyes blazing. "I'm going to fix this." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I will." Over the next few days, more reports came in. Fields burned, fences torn down, livestock run off. Every settler who'd been using Vivian's methods was being targeted, their progress systematically destroyed. The message was clear. Victor Hale would not tolerate interference. But something else happened too. Something Victor hadn't expected. The settlers started fighting back. It started small. Thomas Garrett rebuilt his fence and replanted his field, using seeds Vivian had given him. A widow named Claire Hobbs, whose small garden had been trampled, rallied her neighbors to help her start over. An older man named Samuel Cross, who'd been farming the frontier for 30 years, rode up to Caleb's homestead with a rifle and told Vivian he'd stand guard while she taught a group of new settlers how to plant legumes. "We're not backing down," Samuel said, his weathered face set with determination. "Victor thinks he can scare us, but he's wrong. We've got nothing left to lose." Vivian looked at the group of settlers gathered in Caleb's yard, their faces hard and hopeful, and something shifted inside her. She'd spent so long running, so long hiding, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand with people instead of apart from them. "All right," she said, "then we make sure he knows we're not going anywhere." They organized. Not officially, not with lawyers or documents, but with the kind of quiet, stubborn solidarity that came from people who'd been pushed too far. Settlers started traveling in groups, protecting each other's land, sharing resources. Vivian held teaching sessions in town, right in the middle of Red Hollow's main street, daring Victor's men to stop her. Caleb and Samuel stood watch, rifles in hand, while she explained crop rotation and soil restoration to crowds of farmers who listened like she was preaching survival. Victor heard about it, of course, and he didn't like it one bit. He called a meeting in the back room of the Broken Spoke Saloon, summoning every man on his payroll. Dugan was there, along with a dozen ranch hands, hired guns, and enforcers. Victor stood at the head of the table, his face dark with fury. "This woman is making fools of us," he said. "She's turning a bunch of dirt farmers into a mob, and they're acting like they've got a right to resist. I want this stopped, now." "We've been hitting their fields," Dugan said, "burning crops, tearing down fences. What else do you want us to do?" "I want you to hit her," Victor said. "Directly, publicly. I want everyone in this territory to know what happens when you cross me." One of the hired guns, a lean man named Colfax, leaned forward. "You want us to hurt her? I want you to remind her that she doesn't exist," Victor said coldly. "She's got no papers, no claim, no legal standing. If she disappears, nobody can prove she was ever here." The room went quiet. Even Dugan looked uncomfortable. "Boss, if we go after her directly, Mercer's going to come for us. And those settlers, they're watching her like she's some kind of saint. This could blow up." "Then let it blow up," Victor snapped. "I didn't build this empire by being afraid of farmers. Do what I'm paying you to do, or I'll find someone who will." The men exchanged glances, but none of them argued. Victor Hale didn't make idle threats. 2 nights later, Vivian was walking back to the cabin from the barn when she heard hoofbeats. She turned, her heart jumping into her throat, and saw 3 riders coming up the road. They weren't moving fast, but they weren't being subtle either. They wanted her to see them. Caleb was inside the cabin. Vivian started toward the door, but one of the riders spurred his horse forward, cutting her off. She recognized him. Colfax, one of Victor's hired guns. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Evening, Miss Ashcroft," Colfax said, his voice smooth and cold. "Mr. Hale wants to have a conversation with you." "I've got nothing to say to him," Vivian said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's too bad, because he's got plenty to say to you." The cabin door slammed open and Caleb stepped out with his rifle leveled at Colfax's chest. "Get off my property!" Colfax didn't flinch. "Easy, Mercer. We're just delivering a message." "Then deliver it and leave." "The message is this," Colfax said, turning back to Vivian. "You don't belong here. You've got no right to teach these people. No right to interfere with the way things work. Mr. Hale's been patient, but his patience is running out. If you're smart, you'll leave. Tonight." "And if I don't?" Vivian asked. Colfax smiled. It was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "Then Mr. Hale will make you leave. One way or another." "Tell Victor I'm not going anywhere," Vivian said, her voice hard. "And if he wants me gone, he'll have to come do it himself." Colfax's smile faded. He looked at Caleb, then back at Vivian, then shrugged. "Your funeral." He mounted his horse, and the three riders turned and disappeared into the darkness. Caleb lowered the rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Vivian stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "We need to end this," Caleb said, "before someone gets killed." "I know," Vivian said, "but I don't know how." "We find proof," Caleb said. "Proof that Victor's behind all of this. The burned fields, the threats, all of it. We take it to the territorial marshal and let the law handle it." Vivian looked at him like he'd just suggested they fly to the moon. "The law? Caleb, Victor owns the law. Half the sheriffs in this territory are on his payroll." "Not all of them, and the marshal's a federal man. He answers to Washington, not Victor." Vivian wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that justice was possible, that they could fight Victor with something other than guns and violence, but she'd seen too much of the world to trust in systems that had never protected people like her. Still, it was better than doing nothing. "All right," she said. "We find proof. But how?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Victor keeps records. He's too smart not to. Ledgers, contracts, payroll records. If we can get into his office, we might find something we can use." "That's insane. His ranch is crawling with armed men." "I know, but it's the only chance we've got." Vivian stared at him, this man who'd won her in a poker game and somehow become the most honorable person she'd ever met. "You'd risk your life for this?" "I'd risk my life for you," Caleb said simply. "So yeah." Vivian's chest tightened. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it hard. "Then we do it together." Caleb squeezed back. "Together." They spent the next 3 days planning. Caleb scouted Victor's ranch from a distance, watching the patterns of the guards, noting when they changed shifts, when the office was least occupied. Vivian gathered supplies, rope, a lantern, a knife, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. On the fourth night, they rode out under cover of darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough light to see by, which was exactly what they needed. They left their horse tied in a grove of trees half a mile from Victor's ranch and approached on foot, moving slowly through the tall grass. The ranch was huge, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by corrals and bunkhouses. Caleb led Vivian to the main house, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and expensive glass windows. Victor's office was on the first floor, in the back. Caleb had seen him working there through the window during his scouting trips. They crept around to the side of the house, staying low. Caleb tested the window and found it unlocked. He slid it open slowly, the old wood creaking softly, and climbed inside. Vivian followed, her heart hammering in her chest. The office was dark and smelled like cigars and leather. Caleb lit the lantern, keeping the flame low, and they started searching. Vivian went through the desk drawers while Caleb checked the filing cabinets. They found contracts, land deeds, payroll records, all of it meticulously organized. And then Vivian found the ledger. It was a thick, leather-bound book tucked into the bottom drawer of the desk. She opened it and started flipping through the pages, her eyes widening with each entry. Payments to sheriffs, bribes to judges, lists of settlers whose land had been acquired through foreclosure, except the dates didn't match up. Properties had been seized months before the loans were even due. "Caleb," Vivian whispered, "look at this." Caleb came over and read over her shoulder. His face went pale. "This is everything. Proof of fraud, bribery, extortion. If we get this to the marshal, Victor's finished." "Then let's take it and go." Vivian closed the ledger and tucked it under her arm. They moved toward the window and froze. Footsteps. Coming down the hall. Caleb grabbed Vivian and pulled her behind the desk just as the office door opened. Victor Hale walked in, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and sat down in his chair. He didn't light a lamp. He just sat there in the darkness, sipping his drink. Vivian held her breath, her body pressed against Caleb's, the ledger clutched to her chest. If Victor opened that bottom drawer, if he realized it was missing, they were dead. Victor sat for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood, drained his glass, and walked back out of the room, closing the door behind him. Caleb and Vivian waited another full minute before moving. Then they climbed out the window and ran. They didn't stop running until they reached their horse. Caleb practically threw Vivian into the saddle and climbed up behind her, spurring the animal into a gallop. They rode hard through the night, the ledger pressed between them, proof of Victor's crimes burning like a brand against Vivian's ribs. When they finally reached the homestead, the sun was starting to rise. Caleb helped Vivian down from the horse, and they stood there in the yard, breathless and shaking. "We did it," Vivian said, almost disbelieving. "We actually did it." "Yeah," Caleb said. "Now we just have to survive long enough to use it." They had maybe 6 hours before Victor realized the ledger was gone. Caleb knew it, Vivian knew it, and neither of them wasted time pretending otherwise. The moment the sun cleared the horizon, Caleb was saddling a fresh horse while Vivian wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and tied it with twine like it was the most fragile thing in the world. "The territorial marshal's office is in Helena," Caleb said, checking the saddle straps. "That's 2 days' hard ride from here." "Victor will send men after us the second he figures out what we took," Vivian said. "We won't make it halfway. Then we don't go to Helena." Caleb swung himself into the saddle. "We go to Red Hollow first. We show that ledger to every settler, every farmer, every person Victor's ever screwed over. We make copies if we can, spread the word before Victor can bury it. By the time his men come for us, half the territory will know what he's done." Vivian stared at him. "That's not a plan. That's suicide." "You got a better idea?" She didn't. So she climbed up behind him, the ledger pressed against her chest, and they rode down the mountain into Red Hollow as the morning light turned the fields golden. The town was just waking up when they arrived. Shopkeepers were sweeping their porches, the blacksmith was already hammering away in his forge, and a handful of early risers were gathered outside the mercantile drinking coffee. Caleb rode straight into the middle of the street and dismounted, Vivian right behind him. "Listen up!" Caleb's voice cut through the morning quiet like a gunshot. People turned, startled. A few recognized him and looked confused. "I need everyone to gather here, right now. This is important." "What the hell are you doing, Mercer?" It was Dutch, the bartender from the Broken Spoke, standing in the doorway with a dish rag in his hands. "You drunk?" "I'm dead sober, and you're going to want to hear this." Caleb turned to Vivian. "Show them." Vivian unwrapped the ledger, her hand shaking slightly, and held it up. "This belongs to Victor Hale. It's a record of every bribe, every piece of fraud, every illegal land seizure he's committed in the last 10 years. The crowd that had started to gather went silent. More people were coming now, drawn by the commotion. Thomas Garrett was there, along with his wife Mary. Samuel Cross pushed through the crowd, his weathered face hard with interest. Even Emmett Glover, the cattle buyer who'd been at the poker table the night Caleb won Vivian, stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed. "You stole from Victor Hale?" someone asked, disbelief thick in their voice. "Damn right we did," Caleb said. "And if you've ever lost land to him, if you've ever been cheated or threatened or run off your property, you need to see what's in this book." Vivian opened the ledger and started reading. Names, dates, amounts. Payments to Sheriff Coburn to look the other way during property seizures. A bribe to Judge Talbot to rule in Victor's favor during a water rights dispute. A list of settlers whose loans had been called in early, their land foreclosed and sold to Victor at a fraction of its value. She read for 5 minutes straight, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut, and the crowd grew larger with every word. When she finished, the silence was suffocating. Then Samuel Cross stepped forward, his face like stone. My brother lost his land 3 years ago. Victor said the loan was overdue, but my brother swore he had another 6 months. Judge Talbot ruled against him, and Victor took the property. He pointed at the ledger. Is it in there? Vivian flipped through the pages and found the entry. Yes. Your brother's name is Jacob Cross? Was, Samuel said bitterly. He hung himself 2 months after he lost the land. A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. People started shouting questions, demanding to see the ledger themselves. Vivian handed it to Samuel, who read the entry with shaking hands, then passed it to the next person. The book moved through the crowd like fire, each person finding their own name or the name of someone they knew, each discovery adding fuel to the rage building in the street. This is everything, Thomas Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. This proves Victor's been stealing from us for years. So what do we do about it? Someone shouted. We take it to the marshal, Caleb said. We make sure every lawman in the territory sees this. Victor Hale's done. He just doesn't know it yet. He'll know it the second you ride out of town, Emmett Glover said. He'd moved closer, his expression unreadable. Victor's got men watching the roads. You think you're just going to waltz into Helena with that ledger and everything's going to be fine? No, Caleb admitted, but I'm going to try. Then you're a fool. Emmett looked at Vivian, then back at Caleb. But you're a brave fool, I'll give you that. Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the street. Everyone turned. A group of riders was approaching fast, at least a dozen of them, led by Dugan. They pulled up hard in front of the crowd, their horses snorting and stamping. Dugan's eyes swept over the gathered settlers, then locked on to Caleb and Vivian. Mercer, Dugan said, his voice cold. Mr. Hale wants his property back. This isn't his property, Caleb said. It's evidence of his crimes. I don't care what you call it. Hand it over or we take it. The crowd shifted, some people stepping back, others moving forward to stand beside Caleb and Vivian. Samuel Cross had his hand on his gun. Thomas Garrett picked up a piece of lumber leaning against the mercantile wall. Even Dutch, the bartender, had come out into the street holding a shotgun. Dugan saw it and his jaw tightened. You people don't know what you're doing. We know exactly what we're doing, Samuel said. We're standing up to a thief. You're standing up to the most powerful man in the territory, Dugan shot back. And that's going to get you killed. Maybe, Caleb said, but at least we'll die knowing we tried to do the right thing. Can you say the same? For a moment, Dugan looked like he wanted to draw his gun and end it right there. But he was outnumbered, and he knew it. The settlers had formed a loose circle around Caleb and Vivian, a human wall that would have to be torn down to get to the ledger. Dugan's men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of shooting unarmed townspeople in broad daylight. This isn't over, Dugan said finally. He yanked his horse around and rode off, his men following. The crowd watched them go, and then a ragged cheer went up. People were slapping Caleb on the back, shaking his hand, telling him he'd done a brave thing. But Caleb wasn't celebrating. He was watching the road where Dugan had disappeared, his gut tight with dread. He's going straight to Victor, Vivian said quietly. I know. Victor's going to come for us, and he won't come alone. I know that too. Samuel Cross stepped up beside them, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Then we make sure he doesn't get what he wants. We're with you, Mercer. All of us. Caleb looked around at the faces surrounding him. Farmers, shopkeepers, widows, drifters, people who'd been beaten down by this land and by men like Victor Hale, but who weren't beaten yet. If you stand with us, you're putting yourselves in danger. Victor doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. We know, Thomas Garrett said, but we're done being afraid. Vivian felt something crack open inside her chest. These people, most of whom she'd only met a few weeks ago, were willing to risk everything to protect her and the proof she'd stolen. It was the first time in her life she'd felt like she belonged to something bigger than herself. All right, Caleb said. Then here's what we do. We ride to Helena in groups, spread out, take different routes, make it harder for Victor's men to track us. Half of us go with the ledger, the other half create a diversion. If we move fast and smart, we might get there before Victor can stop us. And if he does stop us, someone asked, then we fight. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Nobody argued. They all knew it might come to that. They spent the next hour organizing. Samuel Cross took charge of one group, a mix of armed men and a few women who could shoot as well as any man. Thomas Garrett led another, taking a longer route through the hills. Caleb and Vivian would ride straight through with the Ledger, accompanied by Emmett Glover, who'd surprised everyone by volunteering to help. "Why are you doing this?" Vivian asked him as they prepared to leave. "You didn't exactly seem like the heroic type the night we met." Emmett shrugged. "I'm not. But Victor's been squeezing me on cattle prices for years, and I'm tired of it. Plus, I like a good gamble, and this?" He gestured at the Ledger. "This is the biggest gamble I've ever seen." They rode out just before noon, the Ledger wrapped in oilcloth and strapped to Caleb's saddle. The plan was to make Helena in a day and a half if they pushed hard. Behind them, Red Hollow emptied as settlers mounted horses, hitched wagons, and set off in different directions, all of them part of the same desperate mission. Victor's retaliation came faster than anyone expected. Caleb, Vivian, and Emmett were maybe 10 miles out of Red Hollow when they heard gunfire echoing across the valley. They pulled up, listening, and Caleb's face went pale. "That's coming from the east, Samuel's route." "They're hitting the diversion groups," Emmett said, "trying to scatter everyone before we can reach Helena." "We keep moving," Caleb said, though his voice was tight. "That's the plan. We get this Ledger to the marshal no matter what." They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping only to water the horses. By the time the sun started to sink, they'd covered nearly 30 miles. But they weren't alone anymore. Caleb spotted riders on the ridge to the north, shadows moving against the skyline. Victor's men tracking them. "They're closing in," Vivian said. "I know. We need to find cover before dark." They pushed into a narrow canyon as the light failed, the walls rising steep on either side. It was a defensible position, but also a trap if they got cornered. Caleb didn't like it, but they didn't have a choice. They made camp in a sheltered alcove, built a small fire, and took turns keeping watch. Around midnight, Vivian woke to the sound of horses. She shook Caleb awake, and he grabbed his rifle, moving to the edge of the camp. In the moonlight, they could see riders approaching, maybe 6 or 7 of them. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted to be seen. "Mercer!" It was Dugan's voice, echoing off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Come out and talk." Caleb glanced at Vivian, then stepped out into the open, his rifle leveled. "Talk about what?" Dugan rode closer, stopping just outside rifle range. "Mr. Hales made you an offer. You give back what you stole, and he'll let you and the woman ride away. No harm, no charges. You disappear, and this whole thing ends." "And the settlers?" Caleb asked. "What happens to them?" "That's not your concern." "It is my concern. Those people stood up for us. I'm not abandoning them." Dugan sighed like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "Then you're a dead man, Mercer. Victor's not going to let you reach Helena. He's got men on every road, watching every town. You're not getting out of this territory alive." "Maybe not," Caleb said, "but I'm damn sure going to try." Dugan stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You always were too proud for your own good." He turned his horse and rode back into the darkness. His men followed, their shapes dissolving into shadow. Vivian came up beside Caleb, her face pale. "They're going to attack, aren't they?" "Probably, but not tonight. Dugan's smart. He'll wait until we're moving again, catch us in the open where they've got the advantage." "Then we don't move in the open." Emmett had been listening from the shadows, and now he stepped forward. "There's an old mining trail that runs parallel to the main road. It's rough, barely wide enough for horses, but it'll get us to Helena without being seen." "How do you know about it?" Caleb asked. "I used to run cattle through there before Victor muscled me out. It's a hard ride, but if we leave before dawn, we can make Helena by tomorrow night." Caleb looked at Vivian. She nodded. "Let's do it." They broke camp in the dark, moving by feel more than sight. The mining trail was as bad as Emmett had warned, a narrow track carved into the side of a steep ridge. In some places it was barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop on one side. The horses picked their way carefully, and every loose rock that skittered down into the ravine made Vivian's heart jump into her throat. They rode through the night and into the morning, exhaustion pressing down on them like a physical weight. But the trail worked. By mid-afternoon, they emerged onto a high plateau, and in the distance they could see Helena, a sprawl of buildings nestled in a valley. They'd made it, but they weren't safe yet. As they started down the slope toward the town, Vivian spotted movement behind them. Riders, coming fast. She grabbed Caleb's arm. "They found us." Caleb looked back and cursed. It was Dugan and at least a dozen men, maybe more. They were still a mile away but closing fast. "We need to reach the town. Once we're in Helena, they can't touch us. Too many witnesses." They spurred their horses into a gallop, racing down the slope. The town grew closer, the streets becoming visible, people moving between buildings. But the riders behind them were gaining. Caleb could hear the thunder of hoofbeats, the shouts of men closing in for the kill. They hit the outskirts of Helena at full speed, their horses foaming and wild-eyed. People scattered as they charged through the streets, heading straight for the center of town where the territorial marshal's office stood. Caleb practically threw himself off his horse, grabbed the ledger, and ran for the door with Vivian right behind him. Dugan and his men pulled up in the street, their horses snorting and stamping. But they didn't dismount. They just sat there, watching, as Caleb kicked open the door to the marshal's office and disappeared inside. The marshal was a grizzled man in his 60s named Harlan Stone. He looked up from his desk, startled, as Caleb and Vivian burst in, followed by Emmett. "What in the hell?" "Victor Hale's been committing fraud, bribery, and illegal land seizures for the last 10 years, Caleb said, slamming the ledger down on the desk. "And we've got proof." Marshal Stone stared at them, then at the ledger. Slowly, he opened it and started reading. His expression darkened with every page. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard. "Where'd you get this?" "Victor's office," Vivian said. "We broke in and took it." "So you're admitting to theft?" "I'm admitting to exposing a criminal," Vivian shot back. "And if you're on Victor's payroll like half the other lawmen in this territory, then you can arrest me right now and prove him right." Marshal Stone studied her for a long moment, then looked back at the ledger. "I'm not on anyone's payroll, ma'am. I work for the federal government, and if this is real, Victor Hale's gonna hang." He stood, grabbing his hat. "I'm calling a territorial hearing, 3 days from now. Every judge, every lawman, every landowner in this part of Montana. If Victor wants to defend himself, he can do it in front of everyone." "He's outside right now," Caleb said. "His men followed us here." Marshal Stone walked to the window and looked out at Dugan and his crew. Then he turned back to Caleb and grinned. "Then I guess Victor's about to find out he doesn't run this town." He opened the door and stepped outside, his hand resting on his gun. "You boys looking for someone?" Dugan's jaw tightened. "We're here for Mercer and the woman they stole from Mr. Hale. They brought me evidence of criminal activity. That's not theft. That's civic duty." Marshal Stone crossed his arms. "Now you can ride back to Victor and tell him he's got 3 days to come to Helena and answer for what's in that ledger. Or he can run, and I'll send federal marshals after him. His choice." Dugan stared at him, fury and frustration warring on his face. But he didn't draw his gun. He couldn't. Not here, not in front of witnesses, not with a federal marshal standing between him and his target. So he turned his horse and rode off, his men following. Inside the office, Vivian sank into a chair, her whole body shaking. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. The ledger was in the marshal's hands, and Victor would have to face justice. But Caleb wasn't celebrating. He was staring out the window, watching the street, his face grim. This isn't over. Victor's not going to just show up and admit defeat. He's going to fight. "Let him fight," Marshal Stone said. "I've got the law on my side now, and the law's a hell of a lot stronger than Victor Hale." Caleb wanted to believe that, but he'd lived on the frontier long enough to know that the law and justice weren't always the same thing. The next 3 days were a blur of tension and preparation. Word of the hearing spread across the territory like wildfire. Settlers who'd been victimized by Victor started arriving in Helena, some on horseback, others in wagons, all of them wanting to see the man who'd destroyed their lives finally face consequences. The town swelled with people, and the air crackled with anticipation. Victor arrived on the morning of the hearing, flanked by Dugan and a small army of hired men. He rode through the streets like he owned them, his face a mask of cold fury. People watched from windows and doorways, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. The hearing was held in the largest building in town, the courthouse. Every seat was filled, with more people standing in the back and spilling out into the street. Marshal Stone sat at the front with 2 federal judges who'd ridden in from the capital. Caleb and Vivian sat together in the second row, the ledger resting on the table in front of the judges. Victor sat across the aisle, his lawyer beside him. He didn't look at Caleb or Vivian. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands folded in his lap. Marshal Stone stood and addressed the room. We're here to examine evidence of fraud, bribery, and illegal land seizures committed by Victor Hale over the past decade. The evidence was brought to me by Caleb Mercer and Vivian Ashcroft, and it's been verified by federal auditors. Mr. Hale, you have the right to defend yourself. Do you wish to speak? Victor's lawyer stood. My client denies all charges. The ledger in question was stolen from his private property, which makes it inadmissible. Furthermore, Miss Ashcroft has no legal standing in this territory, and Mr. Mercer is a known associate of hers. Their testimony is unreliable. The ledger's been authenticated, one of the judges said. The handwriting matches Mr. Hale's, and the entries correspond with documented land transfers. The evidence stands. Victor's lawyer started to argue, but the judge cut him off. We'll hear testimony from the settlers who claim to have been defrauded. Call your first witness, Marshal. What followed was 3 hours of devastating testimony. Settler after settler stood and told their stories. Jacob Cross's widow described how her husband had lost his land and then his will to live. Thomas Garrett explained how his loan had been called in early, his crops seized, his family nearly starved. A dozen others followed, each one adding another brick to the wall of evidence against Victor Hale. Vivian was called to testify about the ledger, about how she and Caleb had retrieved it, about what it contained. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, and when Victor's lawyer tried to discredit her by pointing out that she had no legal identity, Marshal Stone shut him down. Miss Ashcroft's identity is irrelevant to the content of that ledger. The facts speak for themselves. By the time the testimony ended, the room was silent. The judges conferred quietly, then one of them stood. Victor Hale, based on the evidence presented, we find sufficient cause to charge you with fraud, bribery, and illegal seizure of property. You'll be held pending trial, and your assets will be frozen until... Victor shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage. You think you can destroy me? I built this territory. I made it what it is. You stole from people who had nothing, Caleb said, standing as well. You ruined lives, destroyed families, and you did it because you could. But you can't anymore. Victor's hand moved toward his coat. Someone shouted a warning, and then everything exploded into chaos. Victor pulled a pistol from inside his jacket and aimed it directly at Vivian. Time seemed to slow. Caleb saw the gun, saw Victor's finger tightening on the trigger, and he didn't think. He just moved. He threw himself in front of Vivian as the shot rang out. The bullet hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He crashed into Vivian, knocking her to the floor as blood spread across his shirt. The courtroom erupted. People were screaming, scrambling for cover. Deputies rushed forward, grabbing Victor and wrestling him to the ground. He fought like a wild animal, still shouting, still trying to reach his gun. Vivian crawled to Caleb, her hands pressing against the wound in his shoulder. Blood was pouring out, hot and slick, and Caleb's face had gone gray. "Stay with me," Vivian said, her voice shaking. "Caleb, stay with me." "I'm here," Caleb managed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm not going anywhere." Marshal Stone was beside them, barking orders. "Get a doctor, now!" He looked at Vivian. "Keep pressure on it. Don't let him bleed out." Vivian nodded, tears streaming down her face. Around them, deputies were dragging Victor out of the courtroom in chains. He was still shouting, still fighting, but his voice was growing fainter. The judges were calling for order, trying to calm the crowd, but nobody was listening. The whole room had descended into chaos. But Vivian didn't care about any of that. She just held on to Caleb, pressing her hands against his wound, whispering to him that he was going to be okay, that she wasn't going to let him die. Because somewhere in the last few weeks, this man had become more than just someone who'd saved her. He'd become someone she couldn't imagine living without, and she'd be damned if she lost him now. The doctor was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never stopped moving. His name was Patterson, and he'd been practicing medicine in Helena for 15 years, which meant he'd seen plenty of gunshot wounds. He worked on Caleb in the back room of his office while Vivian paced outside, her dress still stained with blood, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the wall to stay upright. Marshal Stone sat on a bench nearby, his hat in his hands. "He's tough. He'll pull through." "You don't know that," Vivian said, her voice raw. "I know he threw himself in front of a bullet for you. Man who does that doesn't give up easy." Vivian closed her eyes. The image of Victor's gun and Caleb's body hitting the floor replaying over and over in her mind. She'd seen the decision happen in real time, seen Caleb move without hesitation, and the weight of it was crushing. He could have let her die. He could have stayed where he was and saved himself. But he hadn't. And now he was lying on a table with a bullet hole in his shoulder because of her. The door opened and Dr. Patterson stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. Vivian's heart stopped. He's alive, Patterson said. The bullet went clean through, missed the bone and the major arteries. He lost a lot of blood, but if infection doesn't set in, he should recover. Vivian's knees almost gave out. She grabbed the doorframe for support. Can I see him? He's unconscious right now. The laudanum will keep him out for a few hours. But yes, you can sit with him. Vivian pushed past the doctor and into the room. Caleb was lying on a narrow cot, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His shoulder was bandaged, the white cloth already stained with blood. His face was pale, his hair matted with sweat. Vivian pulled a chair up beside the cot and took his hand, holding it between both of hers. "You stupid, brave man," she whispered. "What were you thinking?" Caleb didn't answer. He just kept breathing, each breath a small victory. Vivian sat with him through the night. Dr. Patterson came and went, checking the bandages, adjusting the blankets. Marshal Stone stopped by once to tell her that Victor had been locked up in the territorial jail and that the judges had ruled in favor of the settlers. Every fraudulent land seizure would be reversed, every bribe investigated, every contract voided. Victor Hale's empire was crumbling, piece by piece. "It's over," Marshal Stone said. "You and Mercer did what no one else could. You brought him down." Vivian nodded, but she didn't feel victorious. She just felt tired and scared and angry that the price of justice had been Caleb's blood. When Caleb finally woke, it was early morning. Sunlight was slanting through the window, and Vivian had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the cot. Caleb's first thought was that his shoulder was on fire. His second thought was that Vivian was still alive, and that made the pain worth it. "Vivian," he croaked. She jerked awake, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. When she saw he was conscious, she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're awake. Thank heaven, you're awake. How long was I out?" "Almost a full day." She grabbed a cup of water from the table and held it to his lips. He drank, the water cool and perfect. "The doctor said you're going to be fine. The bullet went through clean." Caleb tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his shoulder and he fell back with a grunt. "Victor?" "In jail. The judges ruled against him. Everything he stole is being returned to the people who lost it." Caleb closed his eyes, relief washing over him. "We did it." "You almost died doing it," Vivian said, her voice shaking. "Why did you do that? Why did you step in front of me?" Caleb opened his eyes and looked at her. "Because I wasn't going to let him kill you." "But you could have died." "Yeah, but you didn't, so I'd say it worked out." Vivian stared at him, her throat tight. "You're an idiot." "I've been called worse." She wanted to yell at him, wanted to tell him that he didn't get to decide his life was worth less than hers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his good shoulder, tears sliding down her cheeks. Caleb lifted his hand and rested it on the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "I promise." Vivian didn't answer. She just held on to him and tried to believe it. Caleb stayed in Dr. Patterson's care for another week. The pain in his shoulder dulled to a constant ache, and he started moving around more, though the doctor scolded him every time he tried to do too much. Vivian stayed by his side, reading to him, bringing him food, changing his bandages when Patterson was too busy. It was strange, this quiet intimacy between them. They'd been living together for weeks, working side by side, but this was different. This was care born out of something deeper than partnership. On the 5th day, Vivian brought him news from the courthouse. The judges had finished their review of Victor's ledger, and the scope of his crimes was even worse than anyone had realized. Over 300 properties had been seized illegally. Dozens of families had lost everything, and Victor had bribed or intimidated nearly every local lawman in the territory to keep it all quiet. "They're saying it's the biggest fraud case in Montana history," Vivian said, sitting on the edge of Caleb's cot. Victor's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. If they don't hang him first. Good, Caleb said. He didn't feel any satisfaction saying it, just a grim sense of closure. What about the settlers? Are they getting their land back? Most of them, yes. The judges are working through the paperwork now. It'll take months, maybe years, but they'll get what's theirs. Vivian hesitated, then looked at him. There's something else. The judges want to see us, both of us, tomorrow morning. Caleb frowned. What for? I don't know. Marshal Stone just said it was important. The next morning, Caleb let Vivian help him into a clean shirt and walked slowly to the courthouse, his arm in a sling. The pain was manageable if he didn't move too quickly, but every step reminded him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. They were led into a small chamber where the two federal judges sat behind a heavy oak table. Marshal Stone was there too, standing off to the side. One of the judges, a stern man named Whitmore, gestured for them to sit. Mr. Mercer, Miss Ashcroft, thank you for coming. I know you've both been through a great deal. We have, Caleb said. What's this about? Judge Whitmore folded his hands on the table. We've been reviewing not just Victor Hale's crimes, but also the circumstances surrounding Miss Ashcroft's presence in this territory. Specifically, the fact that she was wagered in a poker game and subsequently brought to your homestead. Vivian's stomach dropped. I wasn't wagered willingly. I was taken by a man who had no right to— We understand that, the other judge, a woman named Keller, said gently. And we're not here to accuse you of anything. But the fact remains that under territorial law you have no legal identity, no documentation, no proof of citizenship, no family to vouch for you. That makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Caleb asked, his voice hard. To being claimed by someone else, Judge Whitmore said. Technically, since you won Miss Ashcroft in that poker game, there's an argument to be made that she's legally your property. Caleb's face went dark. She's not my property. She's not anyone's property. We agree, Judge Keller said quickly, which is why we're offering a solution. If you and Miss Ashcroft were to marry, she would gain legal standing as your wife. She'd have a name, documentation, and protection under the law. No one could claim her or challenge her right to exist in this territory. The room went silent. Vivian stared at the judges, her mind racing. Marriage. To Caleb. It made sense legally, she could see that, but it felt wrong, like they were being forced into something neither of them had chosen. And if we don't marry? Vivian asked. Then you remain legally vulnerable, Judge Whitmore said. And I'll be blunt with you, Miss Ashcroft. There are already people asking questions about you. Victor Hale's lawyers are looking for any angle to discredit the case against him, and your lack of legal standing is a weak point they'll exploit. If they can prove you don't exist, they can argue that the evidence you helped obtain is invalid. That's insane, Caleb said. The ledger's real. The crimes are real. Vivian's identity doesn't change that. Legally, it might, Judge Keller said. We're offering you a way to close that loophole. Think of it as a legal formality, nothing more. Vivian looked at Caleb, her heart pounding. He was staring at the table, his jaw tight. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. Finally, he looked up at the judges. Can we have some time to talk about this? Of course, but we need an answer soon. Victor's trial starts in 3 weeks, and we want this resolved before then. They left the courthouse in silence and walked back to the boarding house where Vivian had been staying while Caleb recovered. Once they were alone in her room, Caleb sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, wincing as his shoulder protested. This is ridiculous, he said. They're trying to force us into a marriage just to protect their case. I know, Vivian said. She was pacing, her arms wrapped around herself. But they're right about one thing. I'm vulnerable. I don't exist on paper. Anyone could claim me, drag me off, and there'd be nothing I could do about it. I won't let that happen. You can't stop it just by wanting to, Caleb. The law doesn't work that way. She stopped pacing and looked at him. Maybe we should do it. Get married, I mean, just as a formality, like the judge said. It doesn't have to mean anything. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Is that what you want? A marriage that doesn't mean anything? Vivian's breath caught. She didn't know how to answer that. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted. Caleb had saved her life more times than she could count. He'd given her a home, helped her fight Victor, thrown himself in front of a bullet for her. But she didn't know if that was love or just desperation, two broken people clinging to each other in the middle of a war. I want to be safe, Vivian said finally, "and I want you to be safe. If getting married does that, then yes, I want it." Caleb stood slowly, crossing the room until he was standing in front of her. "I need you to understand something. If we do this, it's not just a legal formality to me. I'm not going to marry you and then treat you like a stranger. You mean too much to me for that." Vivian's eyes burned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I care about you, Vivian. I have for a while now. And if we're going to do this, I want it to be real. Not just a piece of paper, but a real marriage, a partnership, you and me, building a life together." Vivian felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but hope nonetheless. "You really mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." Vivian reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Caleb closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "Then yes," Vivian said softly. "Let's do it, for real." They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Marshal Stone and Dr. Patterson served as witnesses, and Judge Keller officiated. It was quick, simple, and nothing like the grand weddings Vivian had imagined as a girl. But standing there with Caleb's hand in hers, repeating vows that suddenly felt heavier than any words she'd ever spoken, Vivian realized she didn't care about grand ceremonies or fancy dresses. All she cared about was the man beside her and the life they were about to build. When the ceremony ended, Judge Keller smiled. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer. You're now legally recognized as husband and wife in the Montana Territory." She handed Vivian a document, freshly signed and sealed. "This is your marriage certificate. Guard it well. It's your proof of identity now." Vivian took the paper, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, she had a name that meant something. She wasn't just Vivian Ashcroft, the woman with no past and no future. She was Vivian Mercer, wife of Caleb Mercer, and that meant she existed. They spent their first night as a married couple in a small hotel room in Helena. Caleb's shoulder was still healing, so they didn't do much beyond sitting on the bed and talking. But it felt different now, this closeness between them. There was a weight to it, a permanence that hadn't been there before. "You nervous?" Caleb asked. "Terrified," Vivian admitted. "Are you?" "Yeah, but in a good way." He reached over and took her hand. "We're going to be okay, you know. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Vivian squeezed his hand. "I know." They fell asleep like that, fully clothed and holding hands, and Vivian dreamed of green fields and a cabin on a mountain and a life that was finally, impossibly, hers. Victor Hale's trial began 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed every single day, standing room only, with people lined up outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who'd ruled the territory like a tyrant for so long. Caleb and Vivian attended every session, sitting in the front row with the other settlers who'd been victimized. Victor looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of everything stacked against him. His lawyers tried every trick they could think of, arguing technicalities, attacking the credibility of witnesses, even claiming that the ledger had been forged. But the evidence was overwhelming. Settler after settler took the stand and told their stories, and each one chipped away at Victor's defenses. When it was Vivian's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head high and her marriage certificate tucked into her pocket. Victor's lead lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Aldridge, tried to discredit her immediately. "Mrs. Mercer," Aldridge said, emphasizing the title like it was a joke. "Isn't it true that just a few months ago you had no legal identity whatsoever? That you were, in fact, a drifter with no documentation, no family, and no standing in this territory?" "That's true," Vivian said calmly. "And isn't it also true that you were wagered in a poker game like a piece of livestock?" "I was in a situation I didn't choose, yes." "So you were essentially a vagrant, a nobody. And yet we're supposed to believe that you, of all people, uncovered evidence of widespread fraud." Vivian leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Aldridge. "I wasn't a nobody. I was a woman who'd lost everything and was trying to survive. But I still had a mind and I still had knowledge, and I used both to help people. That doesn't make me a vagrant. That makes me a survivor." The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Aldridge tried to recover, but Vivian had already won the room. The trial lasted another week. When it finally ended, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict. guilty on all counts. Victor Hale was sentenced to 20 years in a territorial prison, with the possibility of additional federal charges pending. His assets were seized, his land holdings liquidated, and every penny would go toward compensating the families he'd destroyed. When the sentence was read, Victor sat motionless, his face blank. He didn't shout or protest. He just sat there, a broken man, while deputies led him away in chains. Caleb watched him go and felt nothing but emptiness. There was no satisfaction in watching another man's life end, even a man as cruel as Victor Hale. Outside the courthouse, the settlers celebrated. People were hugging, crying, shaking hands. Thomas Garrett found Caleb and Vivian in the crowd and grabbed them both in a fierce embrace. "You did it! You actually did it!" "We all did it," Vivian said. "Every person who stood up, every person who testified. This wasn't just us." "Maybe," Thomas said. "But you started it. You gave us hope when we didn't have any." Samuel Cross appeared, his weathered face split into a rare smile. "There's talk of building a school up near your homestead, Mercer. Somewhere Vivian can teach people proper farming, share her father's work. Make it official." Vivian's eyes widened. "A school? Why not? You've already been teaching folks for free. Might as well do it somewhere with walls and a roof." Samuel grinned. "Besides, people are calling you the plant woman. Seems fitting you'd have a place to do your work." Vivian looked at Caleb, her heart full to bursting. "What do you think?" "I think it's a damn good idea," Caleb said. "Our land's big enough. We could build it on the South Ridge where the light's good. People could come from all over." "Then let's do it," Vivian said. She turned to Samuel. "Tell people we're starting as soon as the weather allows." The celebration lasted well into the night, but eventually Caleb and Vivian slipped away, riding back toward the mountain as the sun set behind them. Caleb's shoulder still ached, and Vivian was exhausted down to her bones, but neither of them cared. They were going home, together, as husband and wife. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. When they reached the homestead, the fields were green and thriving. The cabin stood solid against the twilight, and the land that had once been dead and angry now looked like possibility. Caleb helped Vivian down from the horse, and they stood there in the yard, looking at everything they'd fought for. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Caleb said. "I thought my life was over before you showed up. I thought I was just going to die alone on this mountain, and nobody would even notice I was gone." "And now?" Vivian asked. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." He turned to her, his good arm wrapping around her waist. "You saved me, Vivian, not the other way around." Vivian shook her head. "We saved each other." Caleb smiled. "Yeah, I guess we did." They walked into the cabin together, the door closing behind them, and the Montana night settled over the mountain like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The wind moved through the trees, and inside the small cabin, two people who'd been strangers just a few months ago held each other and began building the kind of life neither of them had thought possible. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that reminded everyone why the frontier didn't forgive weakness. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing Caleb and Vivian's homestead in white silence. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and Vivian sat at the table sketching plans for the school they'd promised to build come spring. Caleb watched her from his chair by the fire, his shoulders still stiff but healing. The scar was ugly, a puckered reminder of the day he'd chosen her life over his own, but he wore it without complaint. Some mornings it ached so bad he couldn't lift his arm above his head, and Vivian would massage the muscles until they loosened, her hands patient and careful. Those moments felt more intimate than anything else they'd shared, this quiet tending of wounds both visible and buried. "You're staring," Vivian said without looking up from her sketches. "I'm admiring," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Because from here it looks like you're trying to figure out if you made a mistake marrying me." "Only mistake I made was not doing it sooner." Vivian set down her pencil and turned to face him fully. "You don't have to say things like that, you know. We're already married. You don't have to win me over anymore." "I'm not trying to win you over. I'm just telling the truth." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You made this place livable again, Vivian. Before you showed up, I was barely surviving. Now I'm actually living." Vivian's throat tightened. She still wasn't used to this. to someone seeing value in her beyond what she could produce or teach. I didn't do it alone. No, but you started it. Caleb stood and crossed to the table, looking down at her sketches. This school. It's going to change everything, you know that? I hope so. People need to understand that the land doesn't have to be their enemy. They just need to learn how to work with it instead of against it. She traced the outline of the building she'd drawn, a simple structure with large windows and a stone foundation. My father used to say that knowledge was the only thing you could carry everywhere without it weighing you down. I want to give people that. Then we'll build it, Caleb said, soon as the thaw comes. But winter had other plans. 2 weeks later, Vivian woke in the middle of the night feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, but different. Her body felt heavy and alert at the same time, and when she stood to get water, a wave of dizziness forced her back down onto the bed. Caleb woke immediately. What's wrong? I don't know. I just feel off. Over the next few days, the feeling persisted. Vivian was tired all the time, nauseous in the mornings, and certain smells made her stomach turn. She tried to ignore it, tried to push through, but Caleb noticed. He always noticed. You need to see a doctor, he said one morning after she'd barely touched her breakfast. It's probably just the change in weather. My body adjusting. Vivian. Caleb's voice was firm but gentle. Please. So they rode down to Red Hollow, where the town's physician, an older man named Dr. Wells, examined her in his small office above the mercantile. When he finished, he smiled in a way that made Vivian's heart skip. Mrs. Mercer, you're pregnant, about 6 weeks along, I'd say. The world tilted. Vivian gripped the edge of the examination table, her mind racing. Pregnant. She was going to have a child, Caleb's child. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Are you sure? She managed. Quite sure. The signs are all there. You should expect the baby sometime in late spring, early summer. Dr. Wells patted her hand. Congratulations. You and Mr. Mercer must be thrilled. Thrilled wasn't exactly the word Vivian would have chosen. Overwhelmed, maybe. Terrified, definitely. But as she walked out of the office and found Caleb waiting in the street, the look on his face when she told him made everything else fall away. A baby, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're going to have a baby. Are you okay with that? Vivian asked. I know we didn't plan this. I know it's fast. Caleb pulled her into his arms, careful of his still healing shoulder. I'm more than okay with it. He stopped, his voice breaking slightly. I never thought I'd get this. A wife, a family, a reason to wake up in the morning that doesn't feel like punishment. You gave me all of that. Vivian buried her face in his chest and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of possibility. She was going to be a mother. They were going to be parents. And somehow, despite everything they'd been through, despite the violence and fear and near death, they'd built something worth protecting. Word of Vivian's pregnancy spread through the settler community like wildfire. People showed up at the homestead bearing gifts. Baby clothes sewn by hand, carved wooden toys, jars of preserves to help them through the winter. It was the kind of generosity born from gratitude, from people who hadn't forgotten what Caleb and Vivian had risked to bring down Victor Hale. Thomas and Mary Garrett arrived one afternoon with a hand-stitched quilt. Mary made it, Thomas said, his face flushed with pride. Took her 2 months. Mary blushed. It's not much, but we wanted you to have something for the baby. Vivian held the quilt, her fingers tracing the intricate stitching. It's beautiful, thank you. It's the least we could do, Mary said. You gave us our lives back. This is just a small way of saying we won't forget. Samuel Cross came a week later with lumber. For the school, he said, dropping the boards in the yard. Figure you'll want to get started soon as the ground thaws. Might as well have the materials ready. Samuel, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Samuel's weathered face was serious. My brother died because of Victor Hale. You made sure that bastard paid for it. Far as I'm concerned, I owe you more than lumber. By the time January rolled around, the homestead was stocked with enough supplies to last through 2 winters. But the real gift came from an unexpected source. Emmett Glover, the cattle buyer who'd helped them reach Helena, showed up one evening with a legal document in his hands. What's this? Caleb asked, taking the paper. Deed to 40 acres adjacent to your property, Emmett said. It was part of Victor's holdings. Got liquidated during the trial. I bought it at auction and I'm signing it over to you, for the school. Vivian stared at him. Emmett, we can't accept. Yes, you can, and you will. Emmett's gruff exterior cracked slightly. I've spent 20 years watching this territory eat good people alive. You two are proof it doesn't have to be that way. So take the land, build the school, and teach people how to survive without becoming monsters. That's payment enough. Caleb shook his hand, too moved to speak. Emmett nodded once, climbed back on his horse, and rode off into the snow without another word. That night, Caleb and Vivian sat by the fire, the deed spread out on the table between them. 40 acres, Vivian said, her voice full of wonder. We could build dormitories, workshops, greenhouses. We could make this a real center for learning. We will, Caleb said, but first we focus on getting through winter and bringing this baby into the world safe. Everything else can wait. Vivian nodded, resting her hand on her belly. The baby wasn't showing yet, but she could feel the life growing inside her, tiny and fragile, and completely dependent on her not to screw this up. The thought was humbling. She'd spent so long focused on survival, on fighting and running and protecting herself, that the idea of nurturing something felt almost foreign. But she wanted it, more than she'd wanted anything in a long time. Winter deepened, and the world outside became a frozen wasteland. But inside the cabin, warmth and purpose grew. Caleb started carving wooden animals for the baby, a horse, a bear, a wolf, each one smooth and detailed, the work of a man with too much time and too much love to contain. Vivian read everything she could find about childbirth and child-rearing, filling notebooks with information and diagrams, preparing herself the only way she knew how. They talked late into the nights, planning the future, imagining what their child would be like. Would the baby have Caleb's quiet strength or Vivian's fierce determination? Would they love the land the way Vivian did, or would they want something else entirely? What if they hate farming? Vivian asked one night, half joking. Then they hate farming, Caleb said. We'll love them anyway. What if they want to leave? Go east? See the cities? Then we'll let them go, as long as they know they can always come home. Vivian looked at him, this man who'd started as a stranger and become her entire world. You're going to be a good father. I'm going to try, Caleb said. That's all any of us can do. February brought a storm that lasted 5 days, burying the homestead under 3 feet of snow. They were trapped inside, but neither of them minded. It felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them and the life growing between them. And for the first time in Vivian's life, being trapped didn't feel like a prison. It felt like peace. When the storm finally broke, the sun came out bright and blinding, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Caleb dug a path to the barn while Vivian stood on the porch, watching him work. His shoulder was still weak, and she could see him favoring it, but he didn't complain. He never complained. You're staring again, Caleb called without turning around. Vivian smiled. I'm admiring. By March, the baby was showing. Vivian's belly had rounded, and she'd started moving differently, slower and more carefully, her hand often resting on the swell of new life. Dr. Wells rode up to check on her twice, declaring both mother and child healthy and strong. You're doing everything right, he told her. Just keep resting, eating well, and try not to overdo it. Vivian tried, but rest had never come easy to her, and with spring approaching, there was too much to do. Plans for the school needed finalizing, seeds needed ordering, the land needed preparing for planting. She worked alongside Caleb when he let her, and when he didn't, she worked anyway, stubborn and determined. You're going to hurt yourself, Caleb said one afternoon, finding her kneeling in the garden despite his explicit instructions to stay inside. I'm pregnant, not dying, Vivian shot back. I can still plant seeds. You can also rest and let me handle it. I've been resting for 3 months. I'm going insane. Caleb crouched beside her, his expression softening. I know you're restless. But I can't lose you, Vivian. I can't lose either of you. So please, for me, take it easy. Vivian saw the fear in his eyes and felt her stubbornness waver. Okay, I'll take it easy. Promise? Promise. She kept her word mostly. But when the first green shoots started pushing through the soil in early April, Vivian couldn't help but walk through the fields, marveling at the life returning to the land. The crops they'd planted the previous year had been harvested and stored, and now new growth was beginning, the cycle continuing despite everything they'd been through. "It's beautiful," she said to Caleb one evening as they stood on the ridge overlooking their property. "Look at what we did. We took dead land and made it live again." "You did that," Caleb corrected. "I just helped." "No, we did it together." Vivian leaned into him, her belly pressing against his side. "That's how everything works now. Together." Construction on the school began in May. Samuel Cross organized a work crew of settlers, and they descended on the 40 acres Emmett had donated, bringing tools, lumber, and a determination to build something that would last. The foundation went up first, stone hauled from the river and mortared into place. Then the walls, rough-hewn logs, fitted together with precision. By June, the structure stood solid and strong, a testament to what people could accomplish when they worked towards something bigger than themselves. Vivian was 8 months pregnant by then, too swollen and uncomfortable to do much beyond supervise. She sat in the shade with a notebook, sketching lesson plans and curriculum, her mind already racing ahead to the day they'd open the doors and start teaching. "You should name it," Thomas Garrett said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The school. It needs a proper name." Vivian thought for a moment. "The Ashcroft Academy. After my father. He's the one who taught me everything I know. It feels right to honor him." "The Ashcroft Academy," Samuel repeated, testing the words. "I like it. It's got weight." The baby came on a hot night in late June. Vivian's water broke just after sunset, and Caleb rode hell for leather into Red Hollow to fetch Dr. Wells, while Mary Garrett stayed with Vivian, talking her through the contractions and keeping her calm. "You're doing great," Mary said, holding Vivian's hand as another wave of pain rolled through. "Just breathe, in and out. That's it." Vivian wanted to scream that breathing wasn't helping, that her entire body felt like it was being torn apart, but she gritted her teeth and bore it. She'd survived worse. She'd survived men who wanted to own her, a frontier that wanted to kill her, and a system designed to erase her. She could survive this. Caleb burst through the door with Dr. Wells 20 minutes later, his face pale and terrified. "How is she?" "She's strong," Mary said. "Now get over here and hold her hand. She needs you." Caleb moved to Vivian's side, taking her hand in both of his. "I'm here. I'm right here." "Don't leave," Vivian gasped. "I'm not going anywhere." The labor lasted 6 hours. Vivian screamed, cried, cursed Caleb's name more than once, and pushed until she thought she'd break in half. But when Dr. Wells finally held up a squirming, red-faced baby and said, "It's a girl," every second of pain evaporated into pure, overwhelming joy. "A girl," Vivian whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We have a daughter." Dr. Wells cleaned the baby and wrapped her in a blanket, then placed her in Vivian's arms. The infant was tiny, perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to stare up at Vivian with ancient wisdom. Caleb leaned over them both, his hand gentle on the baby's head, and Vivian saw tears on his weathered face. "She's beautiful," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "Just like her mother." "What should we name her?" Vivian asked. Caleb thought for a moment. "Hope. We'll call her Hope, because that's what she is." Vivian looked down at the tiny life in her arms and knew he was right. Hope. It was the perfect name for a child born out of chaos and pain and two people who'd refused to give up on each other. She kissed the baby's forehead, breathing in the sweet new smell of her, and felt something settle deep in her chest. This was what mattered. Not the land, not the school, not the victory over Victor Hale. This tiny person who depended on them completely and gave them a reason to keep fighting, keep building, keep believing that the future could be better than the past. By August, Vivian had recovered enough to start teaching again. The Ashcroft Academy opened its doors with 12 students, a mix of young adults and older settlers who'd never had the chance to learn proper farming techniques. Vivian stood at the front of the room, Hope strapped to her chest in a sling, and taught them everything her father had taught her. Soil composition, crop rotation, companion planting, water conservation. The students listened with an intensity that reminded Vivian why this work mattered. After the first week, one of the students, a young man named Peter, approached her nervously. "Mrs. Mercer, I just wanted to say thank you. My family's been farming the same land for 3 generations, and we've never had a harvest like the one we got last year after using your methods. You saved us." "I didn't save you," Vivian said gently. "I just gave you the tools. You did the work. Still, it means something." It did mean something. Vivian saw it in the faces of every student who walked through the doors of the academy. They weren't just learning how to farm, they were learning that knowledge was power, that understanding the land made them partners with it instead of enemies. And they were taking that knowledge back to their families, their communities, spreading it across the territory like seeds carried on the wind. By fall, the academy had expanded to 25 students. Samuel Cross donated another building for dormitories so people from farther away could stay and study. Emmett Glover funded a library, filling it with books on agriculture, botany, and natural science. Even Marshall Stone came by, bringing news that the territorial government was considering funding more schools like this one across Montana. "You've started something bigger than you realize," Stone told Vivian one afternoon as they watched students working in the demonstration fields. "People are calling this place a miracle. They're saying you've changed the frontier." "I haven't changed anything," Vivian said. "I just showed people what was possible." Sometimes that's all it takes. Winter came again, but this time it felt different. The cabin was warmer, fuller, alive with the sound of Hope's laughter and the constant hum of activity from the academy. Caleb's shoulder had healed as much as it was going to, leaving him with limited mobility but no pain. He wore the scar proudly, and sometimes when they were alone, Vivian would trace the puckered skin with her fingers and remind him that he'd saved her life. "You saved mine first," Caleb always said, "so we're even." They weren't keeping score anymore. That was the thing Vivian had learned over the past year. Love wasn't about owing or being owed. It was about showing up day after day and choosing each other even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside and Hope slept in her cradle by the fire, Caleb and Vivian sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets and watching the academy building silhouetted against the darkening sky. "You ever think about that night in the saloon?" Caleb asked. "The night I won you?" "All the time," Vivian admitted. "I was so angry, so scared. I thought my life was over." "And now?" "Now I think it was just beginning." She turned to look at him. "You could have walked away, Caleb. You could have left me there and saved yourself a world of trouble." "Never crossed my mind." "Why not?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Because I looked at you and saw someone who deserved better than what she was getting. And I figured if I couldn't give you better, at least I could give you a chance. You gave me more than a chance. You gave me a life." "We gave each other a life," Caleb corrected. He reached over and took her hand. "I was dead before you showed up, Vivian. Just going through the motions, waiting for the end. You made me want to live again." Vivian squeezed his hand, her throat tight with emotion. "We make a good team. The best." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall and listening to the wind move through the pine trees. Inside the cabin, Hope stirred and made a small sound, and Vivian stood to check on her. The baby was fine, just shifting in her sleep, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Vivian adjusted the blanket around her and stood there for a moment, marveling at the impossibility of it all. A year ago, she'd been nobody. A woman with no name, no future, no hope. She'd been wagered in a poker game like she was property, dragged to a dying homestead by a stranger, and thrust into a war she hadn't asked for. But she'd fought anyway. And Caleb had fought beside her. And together, they'd torn down an empire built on cruelty and built something new in its place. The Ashcroft Academy wasn't just a school. It was proof that the frontier didn't have to be a place where only the ruthless survived. It could be a place where knowledge mattered, where people helped each other, where someone like Vivian could go from being worthless to invaluable simply by sharing what she knew. And that mattered, not just for her, but for every person who walked through those doors and learned that they didn't have to accept the world as it was. They could change it. One seed, one lesson, one act of kindness at a time. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we've come," Vivian said. "How much has changed." "You regret any of it?" "Not for a second." They stood there together watching their daughter sleep, and Vivian felt something she'd never felt before. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was fleeting and fragile. But contentment, the deep bone-level satisfaction of knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. That was something rare and precious. Spring came again, as it always did. turning the fields green and bringing new students to the academy. Vivian taught, Caleb farmed, and Hope grew from an infant into a curious, bright-eyed toddler who loved the dirt as much as her mother did. The homestead that had once been a monument to failure became a symbol of resilience, and people came from across the territory to see the place where Victor Hale had been brought down, and a new way of living had taken root. On the first anniversary of their marriage, Caleb and Vivian stood on the ridge overlooking their land. The academy buildings were full of students. The fields were thriving. Hope was chasing butterflies through the grass, her laughter echoing across the valley. "You know what I realized?" Vivian said. "That night in the saloon, when you won me in that poker game, everyone laughed. They thought you were a fool for taking me home instead of walking away." "I remember. They were wrong. You weren't a fool. You were the only person in that room who saw me as human." Caleb turned to face her. "I didn't see you as human, Vivian. I saw you as someone worth fighting for. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah. Because being human is easy. Being worth fighting for, that's something you earn." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't earn anything. I was just trying to survive. And that's exactly why you were worth it." Caleb cupped her face in his hands. "You didn't give up. You didn't let them break you, and you used everything you had, your knowledge, your strength, your stubbornness, to help people. That's what made you worth fighting for." Vivian kissed him, long and slow, and when they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you, Caleb Mercer." "I love you too, Vivian Mercer." Hope ran up to them, her hands full of wildflowers. "Mama, look what I found!" Vivian crouched down and took the flowers, admiring each one. "They're beautiful, sweetheart, just like you." Hope beamed and ran off again, chasing more butterflies. Caleb helped Vivian stand and they watched their daughter play, this tiny person who represented everything they'd fought for. "You think she'll understand someday?" Vivian asked. "What it took to build this?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or maybe she'll just grow up thinking the world is supposed to be like this, fair, kind, full of people who help each other, and maybe that's better." Vivian thought about that. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe the whole point of fighting wasn't to make sure the next generation knew how hard it had been. Maybe the point was to make it so they never had to know. To build something so solid and good that struggle became a story from the past instead of a reality of the present. That's what they'd done here. They'd taken a piece of brutal, unforgiving frontier and turned it into a place where people could learn, grow, and thrive. They'd proven that strength didn't have to mean cruelty, and survival didn't have to mean stepping on others to get ahead. And they'd done it by refusing to treat each other as anything less than partners. Equals. Two people who'd started with nothing and built everything. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Caleb and Vivian stood together on their land and watched their daughter play. The fields were green, the academy was thriving, the future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of promise. They'd started as strangers in a saloon, one man's desperate gamble to do something decent in a world that rewarded cruelty. And they'd become proof that sometimes the best things in life come from refusing to accept that the world has to stay the way it is. You can change it. You just have to be willing to fight for something better, even when everyone's laughing at you for trying.